The elderly man stepped into the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face downcast. "Name?" the clerk asked. He answered in a trembling voice, "Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." No one expected what happened next. Minutes later, as the female judge reviewed his file, she suddenly froze, her face draining of color. That name belonged to the man who had saved her brother's life on the battlefield of Fallujah. Before making the ultimate sacrifice, type respect. If you believe honor doesn't fade just because we grow poor or old. Mason Quinn, 69, sat on the courtroom bench, his shoulders slumped beneath a faded military jacket 2 sizes too large. The harsh fluorescent lights accentuated deep lines carved by time and hardship across his once proud face. Decades ago, he'd stood tall in dress blues, medals gleaming on his chest. Today, he waited for judgment in clothes acquired from a shelter donation bin. The bailiff called his case. The elderly man stepped into the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face downcast. "Name?" the clerk asked. He answered in a trembling voice, "Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." No one expected what happened next. Minutes later, as the female judge reviewed his file, she suddenly froze, her face draining of color. That name belonged to the man who had saved her brother's life on the battlefield of Fallujah. Before making the ultimate sacrifice, type respect. If you believe honor doesn't fade just because we grow poor or old. Mason Quinn, 69, sat on the courtroom bench, his shoulders slumped beneath a faded military jacket 2 sizes too large. The harsh fluorescent lights accentuated deep lines carved by time and hardship across his once proud face. Decades ago, he'd stood tall in dress blues, medals gleaming on his chest. Today, he waited for judgment in clothes acquired from a shelter A no trespass order would mean no access to the shelter on 4th Street, the only warm bed Mason had known in months. It would mean no meals at St. Luke's Church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It would mean true isolation in the coldest part of winter. "Mr. Quinn," Judge Olivia Parker addressed him directly. "Do you have representation today?" Mason shook his head. The public defender assigned to him had been called to another courtroom for an emergency hearing. "Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" There was a pause. Then Mason quietly said, "If I may, yes." But before he could continue, the courtroom doors opened. A distinguished man in an expensive suit walked in. Approaching the public defender's table, he addressed the court. "Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant. I apologize for the interruption, but I've been retained to represent Mr. Quinn." Mason looked up, confused. He hadn't called anyone. He couldn't afford a lawyer, especially not one in a suit like that. "This is highly irregular," Judge Parker noted. "It's a very recent development," Rossi replied smoothly. "I'd request a brief recess to confer with my client." The judge studied him, then Mason. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, rising suddenly and disappearing into her chambers. Mason turned to the stranger beside him. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "You don't need any," Rossi replied quietly. "The firm of Williams, Rossi and Parker is handling your case pro bono." Mason frowned. "Parker? Like the judge?" "Exactly like the judge," Rossi confirmed. In her chambers, Judge Olivia Parker removed her glasses with trembling hands. 20 years on the bench had taught her to maintain composure no matter what appeared before her court. But nothing had prepared her for this. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a worn photograph. Herself as a young woman beside her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, at his commissioning ceremony. His last letter home sat beside it, paper thin from countless readings. In that letter, he'd written about a firefight outside Fallujah. His unit was pinned down. If not for Staff Sergeant Quinn, Jack had written, none of us would have made it out. He ran through gunfire, reached a fallen Marine, and provided cover so others could evacuate. 2 weeks later, Jack had been killed by an IED. At his funeral, a Marine had approached her family. "Your son saved my life," it said. "I was the one he pulled to safety before." He hadn't finished the sentence. He didn't need to. That Marine was Mason Quinn. Olivia had tried to find him after the funeral, but he'd been redeployed. Years later, she learned he'd been discharged after suffering severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. And now, 20 years later, he was in her courtroom, homeless, alone, and unrecognized. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Alexander Rossi entered. "It's him, Alex," she said, showing him the photo. "The Marine who saved Jack." Rossi's eyes widened. "The one you've been trying to find for years?" She nodded. "What happened to him?" she asked. Rossi replied, "PTSD after his final tour. His wife left. VA benefits tangled in bureaucracy. Worked construction until injuries made labor impossible. The rest followed. Job loss, foreclosure, the streets." She closed her eyes. "Quinn is the best of us," her brother had once written. "The kind who'd give everything for his Marines." "What are you going to do?" Rossi asked. "I'm not letting him slip away again," she said firmly. "There are ethical considerations in how we treat those who sacrificed everything for our country." "Mr. Rossi, has your client decided how to proceed?" "We request dismissal of all charges," Rossi said. "My client was simply seeking warmth in dangerous conditions." The prosecutor began to object, but Judge Parker raised her hand. "Mr. Quinn," she said, "your military record indicates service in Fallujah, 2004. Is that correct?" Mason straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. On April 17th, 2004. Were you involved in an operation near the western outskirts of the city?" "Yes, ma'am. We came under heavy fire while escorting a convoy." "Did you rescue a wounded Marine named Lieutenant Jack Parker?" The courtroom fell silent. Mason's eyes filled with memory. "Yes. He was hit trying to reach a corpsman. I got to him, pulled him behind a wall. He kept telling me to leave him. But I got him to the medevac." A silver-haired Marine in the gallery stood up. "That's him," he shouted. "That's Quinn!" Judge Parker sat down. "This court will take a 10-minute recess." Before leaving, she looked directly at Mason. "When I return, there are matters beyond these charges we need to discuss." In her chambers once more, Judge Parker's composure finally cracked. She pressed trembling fingers to her lips, suppressing emotions that had waited 2 decades. After a few breaths, she picked up the phone. "Colonel Matthews, it's Olivia Parker. Yes, I know it's been years. I need a favor, urgently." When she returned 10 minutes later, she wasn't alone. 3 Marines followed her, a full colonel, a master sergeant, and a corporal carrying a polished wooden case. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. At the sight of the uniforms, Mason stood instinctively, muscle memory overriding pain. Judge Parker faced the room, removing her glasses. "For the first time in my career," she said, "I must disclose a personal connection to this case. The Lieutenant Jack Parker mentioned earlier." A wave of stunned murmurs. Mason's face shifted, recognition dawning. 20 years ago," she continued, "my brother wrote to our family about the man who saved his life in Fallujah. That man was Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn." The silver-haired Marine called out, It's true. I was there. Quinn got hit twice, pulling the lieutenant to cover. Judge Parker nodded. She turned to Mason. After Jack died, I tried to find you, but the military told me you'd been redeployed. Later, that you'd been discharged, but your location was unknown. Mason stood still, his face unreadable. I never stopped looking, she said, her voice shaking. And now, by fate or divine intervention, you're here. She gestured to the colonel. Colonel Matthews stepped forward. Staff Sergeant Quinn, the Marine Corps has been trying to locate you. Your file was flagged under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. New intel confirmed that your actions disrupted an ambush that could have wiped out the entire convoy. The corporal opened the case. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, and in recognition of conspicuous gallantry, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Mason stared in disbelief. There's some mistake, he whispered. I was just doing my job. No mistake, the colonel said. This is long overdue. From the gallery, attention on deck. Veterans rose to attention. One by one, others followed, even the prosecutor rising with quiet respect. The entire courtroom stood in honor of Mason Quinn. Judge Parker wiped tears from her eyes. In light of these circumstances, all charges against Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn are dismissed with prejudice. She struck the gavel. This court stands adjourned. The Master Sergeant approached. Sir, your disability rating has been reassessed at 100%, retroactive to your discharge. What does that mean? Mason asked. It means full medical, back pay, housing, education, and the dignity you earned long ago. Rossi stepped in. Our firm will process everything. No more delays. From the back of the courtroom, Jimmy the cook approached, teary-eyed. My dad always said a Marine saved his whole unit. If I ever met a Mason Quinn, I owed him everything. I never realized it was you. Even the prosecutor came forward. Sir, I had no idea. Please accept my apology. Judge Parker left the bench and walked directly to Mason. My brother told us, you said no Marine gets left behind while I'm breathing. Her voice trembled. Today, Sergeant Quinn, we fulfill that same promise to you. 2 weeks later, Mason stood in a modest apartment, one he still couldn't believe was his. The only decoration, a frame holding his Navy Cross, Purple Hearts, and old medals Rossi had recovered from an auction storage unit. A knock at the door. Judge Parker stood there, casual, out of her robes, holding a box. May I come in, Sergeant Quinn? Please, just Mason, he said. Then I'm just Olivia, she smiled. They sat in the small living area, awkward at first. I brought something, she said. Letters, from Jack. This one mentions you. Mason unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It read, Mum and Dad, don't worry. I'm safe. Thanks to one of my NCOs. Staff Sergeant Quinn did something yesterday I still can't believe. He moved through fire that should have dropped anyone. He wouldn't leave me, even when I ordered him to. Said no Marine gets left behind on his watch. Mason's voice broke. He wrote about you often, Olivia said softly. Said you were the kind of Marine he wanted to become. Mason looked down. He was a good officer. Young, but he cared about his men. That's rare. I started the Veterans Court program, the housing initiative, because of Jack. Because of what he wrote about you. She paused, then added, the day Jack died, he was leading a patrol to find insurgents targeting civilians. He volunteered. His last letter said, he was trying to live up to the example you set. That hit Mason harder than any injury ever had. For 20 years, he'd wondered if saving Jack only prolonged the inevitable. "Olivia," he whispered, "all those years on the street, I thought no one remembered, that it meant nothing." "It meant everything," she replied, "to Jack, to those Marines, and to me." As she stood to leave, she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Jack used to say, the measure of a Marine isn't what he does when people are watching, but what he does when no one is." You lived that truth, Mason, even when the world looked away. He stood straighter than he had in years. "Someone remembered my name," he said, almost in disbelief. After all this time, someone remembered. In that quiet moment, something long broken began to heal. Not just for Mason Quinn, but for everyone who'd ever been forgotten despite giving everything. Honor doesn't require glory. Sometimes just recognition is enough to help someone stand tall again. Don't let anyone be left behind. Everyone deserves to be heard, respected, and remembered. If you believe that too, comment, respect, and subscribe to Talus Strength to help us share more stories that touch the heart.